Hey everyone! Tonight we're exploring one of history's most fascinating paradoxes. How ancient Egypt built unwavering stability from the eternal rhythm of seasonal uncertainty. Before we settle in, take a moment to like this if you enjoy these deep historical explorations, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always find it fascinating how our global community gathers to explore these complex questions together. Now get comfortable, dim those lights. Tonight, we're not chasing dramatic events or heroic tales. Instead, we're going to examine something much quieter but equally important: how the gentle rise and fall of the Nile's waters created humanity's first sophisticated economic planning system. Let's begin our gentle journey into the rhythms of abundance. Picture, if you will, the pre-dawn darkness along the Nile during flood season, 3,000 years ago. The air carries the rich scent of fertile mud, and somewhere in the distance you can hear the gentle lapping of water against stone steps carved deep into the riverbank. This is the sound of Egypt's heartbeat, the eternal rhythm that shaped not just agriculture, but an entire civilization's approach to abundance, scarcity, and the delicate art of economic planning. Tonight, we'll explore how the Nile's annual flood cycles became far more than a natural phenomenon. They evolved into the foundation of a unique economic system that lasted for millennia, creating institutions and ways of thinking that influenced everything from taxation to temple construction, from seasonal labor to spiritual belief. We'll discover how Egyptian priests became the world's first economic forecasters, how flood measurements determined the fate of kingdoms, and how the patient observation of water levels created mathematical and administrative innovations that still echo in our modern world. This is a story of quiet wisdom, of a civilization that learned to read the subtle signs of nature and transform them into sophisticated systems of human organization. As we journey through these ancient rhythms together, you'll find yourself drawn into a world where the practical and the sacred intertwined, where the rise and fall of river waters determined the rise and fall of human fortunes, and where the patient wisdom of working with natural cycles created one of history's most enduring economic systems. The first light of dawn touches the ancient stone steps of the nilometer at Elephantine, where for millennia the priests of Khnum have descended into the sacred chamber to read the river's whispered promises. The water laps gently against the carefully carved markings, each cubit and palm meticulously measured by generations of keepers who understood that within these quiet depths lay the mathematical foundation of an entire civilization. Here, in the peaceful rhythm of rising and falling waters, ancient Egypt discovered something profound: that the most sophisticated economic systems emerged not from conquest or accumulation, but from the patient observation of natural abundance. The nilometer represents humanity's first systematic attempt to transform environmental observation into economic prediction. These elegant stone structures, found throughout the length of the Nile, from Aswan to the Delta, functioned as both practical instruments and sacred spaces where the boundary between divine communication and economic data dissolved into something entirely new. The priests who tended these sites were Egypt's earliest economic forecasters, men who understood that the height of the flood would determine not merely the year's harvest, but the very rhythm of society itself. Each morning during the flood season, as the sun painted the eastern hills in gentle gold, the keeper of the nilometer would make his careful descent. The stone steps, worn smooth by countless feet, over thousands of years led down into chambers where the river's pulse could be felt most intimately. Here, away from the surface turbulence, the true measure of the flood revealed itself in the steady rise of clear water against ancient markings. The priest would note not merely the height, but the quality of the rise. Was it swift or gradual, steady or irregular? These subtleties, accumulated over generations of observation, formed the foundation of Egypt's economic intelligence. The mathematical sophistication of this system reveals itself in the standardization that gradually emerged across the kingdom. While local variations existed, the nilometer at Memphis measured differently than the one at Thebes, a common understanding developed that allowed flood information to be communicated across vast distances with remarkable precision. The cubit measurements carved into stone were not arbitrary marks, but carefully calibrated indicators that corresponded to specific agricultural and economic outcomes. A flood of 14 cubits might indicate moderate abundance, while 16 cubits promised exceptional fertility, and 12 cubits warned of potential scarcity. This transformation of natural observation into economic data required the development of Egypt's first systematic record-keeping practices. In the quiet chambers adjacent to the nilometer sites, scribes maintained detailed papyrus records that tracked not only water levels but their correlation with subsequent harvests, tax revenues, and social stability. These documents, some of which survive today, reveal a civilization that understood statistical correlation centuries before such concepts were formally articulated. The priests learned to read patterns within patterns, recognizing that a particular sequence of flood heights might predict not just the immediate harvest, but economic conditions several years in advance. The role of the nilometer keeper evolved into one of Egypt's most crucial administrative positions, combining religious authority with economic expertise. These individuals developed specialized knowledge that encompassed hydraulic engineering, agricultural science, and economic forecasting. They understood that their measurements would influence decisions about taxation, grain storage, labor allocation, and even foreign trade. The quiet authority of their pronouncements shaped the economic life of millions, yet they exercised this power through patient observation rather than dramatic intervention. The network of nilometers created Egypt's first integrated economic information system. Signal fires and swift messengers carried flood news from south to north, allowing administrators in the delta to prepare for conditions that had already been measured at Aswan. This communication network transformed local environmental knowledge into kingdom-wide economic intelligence, enabling coordinated responses to flood variations across the entire length of the Nile. The system's sophistication lay not in its technology, but in its recognition that economic stability required the systematic collection and analysis of environmental data. The priests who managed this system understood something that modern economists are only beginning to rediscover: that sustainable economic systems must be built on careful attention to natural rhythms rather than attempts to dominate them. Their approach was fundamentally contemplative, requiring years of patient observation to develop the intuitive understanding that allowed them to read the river's subtle communications. In the gentle rise and fall of the Nile's waters, they found not chaos to be controlled, but abundance to be understood and carefully managed. The gentle mathematics of abundance and scarcity flowed through ancient Egypt like the Nile itself, creating patterns of economic thought that would influence civilizations for millennia. As the flood waters receded each year, revealing the dark, fertile silt that promised another season of plenty, Egyptian administrators faced the eternal challenge of managing nature's gifts with human wisdom. Their solution was a sophisticated system of surplus management that transformed the unpredictable generosity of the river into the steady foundation of one of history's most enduring civilizations. The great granaries of Memphis and Thebes stood as monuments to this economic philosophy, their massive stone walls containing not just grain, but the accumulated wisdom of generations who understood that abundance, properly managed, could bridge the inevitable seasons of scarcity. These structures, with their carefully designed ventilation systems and precise measuring chambers, represented more than mere storage facilities. They embodied a fundamental insight about the nature of economic security, that true wealth lay not in the accumulation of resources, but in the intelligent distribution of nature's gifts across time. Within these granary complexes, a quiet revolution in economic thinking unfolded daily. Professional grain administrators, their knowledge passed down through generations of service, developed sophisticated methods for testing grain quality, calculating storage capacity, and predicting consumption needs. They understood that different varieties of grain required different storage conditions, that barley stored differently than wheat, and that the timing of storage could affect the quality of grain years later. Their careful records, inscribed on papyrus and stored in administrative archives, created Egypt's first comprehensive economic databases. The seasonal rhythm of this system created its own social calendar. As the flood waters rose, covering the fertile fields with their life-giving silt, the great granaries became centers of intense activity. Workers moved in measured processions, carrying standardized baskets of grain from temporary storage areas to the permanent facilities. The sound of grain pouring into storage chambers created a gentle percussion that marked the transition from harvest abundance to careful preservation. Supervisors tested each delivery, running the grain through their fingers to assess its quality, understanding that the decisions made in these moments would affect the kingdom's food security for years to come. This system of managed abundance created unique trading relationships with neighboring regions. Egyptian merchants, backed by the security of their granary reserves, could engage in long-distance trade with confidence, knowing that temporary shortages could be absorbed by their sophisticated storage systems. The predictable surplus of good flood years became a diplomatic tool, allowing Egypt to extend influence through carefully timed grain exports to regions experiencing scarcity. The biblical account of Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, with its 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, reflects the deep integration of flood cycle thinking into Egyptian economic planning. Archaeological evidence reveals the remarkable sophistication of these storage systems. Granaries were constructed with sloped floors to facilitate complete emptying, raised foundations to prevent moisture damage, and carefully calculated capacities based on regional population needs. The largest facilities could store grain for entire provinces, creating a network of economic security that extended throughout the kingdom. Workers' quarters adjacent to major granaries suggest that grain management was a year-round occupation, requiring constant attention to storage conditions and inventory management. The concept of good years and lean years became deeply embedded in Egyptian economic thought, creating a cultural understanding that abundance was meant to be shared across time. This philosophy influenced not just agricultural policy, but the entire approach to resource management. Craftsmen learned to stockpile materials during abundant seasons, Administrators planned major construction projects around anticipated surpluses, and even religious festivals were timed to coincide with periods of economic plenty. The psychological impact of this system cannot be underestimated. Citizens of ancient Egypt lived with a unique form of economic security, knowing that their civilization had developed sophisticated methods for managing the uncertainties of agricultural life. This security allowed for the flowering of arts, sciences, and monumental architecture that characterized Egyptian civilization. The quiet confidence that came from well-managed abundance created space for the contemplative pursuits that produced Egyptian achievements in mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Modern archaeological investigations continue to reveal the extent of this economic sophistication. Granary sites throughout Egypt show evidence of careful planning, with facilities sized according to regional needs and connected by transportation networks that could move grain efficiently during different flood seasons. The integration of these storage systems with religious and administrative centers demonstrates how thoroughly economic security was woven into the fabric of Egyptian society. The legacy of this approach to abundance and scarcity extends far beyond ancient Egypt, offering timeless insights into the relationship between natural cycles and human economic organization. The Egyptian understanding that true security comes from working with natural rhythms rather than against them provides a contemplative model for sustainable economic thinking that remains relevant today. The gentle rhythm of Egypt's seasonal transformation created something unprecedented in human history, a civilization where the natural world cycles became the foundation for sophisticated labor organization and social harmony. As the Nile's waters rose each year, covering the fertile black earth in their life-giving embrace, Egyptian society underwent its own profound transformation, shifting from the intense activity of harvest to the contemplative productivity of the flood season. During these months of inundation, when the river claimed the fields and villages seemed to float like islands in a vast, shimmering lake, the agricultural population found itself temporarily freed from the demanding cycles of planting and harvesting. Yet this was not a time of idleness. Instead, the flood season became the foundation of Egypt's most remarkable achievement: the integration of agricultural rhythms with monumental construction, creating a society where the building of pyramids and temples flowed as naturally as the river's annual cycle. The transformation began in the villages themselves, where families had learned over countless generations to prepare for the flood's arrival. Houses built on elevated ground or artificial mounds remained dry, while the surrounding landscape disappeared beneath the waters. In these elevated sanctuaries, craftsmen who had spent the growing season as farmers now turned their hands to specialized work. The same careful attention they brought to tending crops was redirected toward weaving fine linen, crafting pottery, working leather, and creating the countless objects that sustained Egyptian civilization. This seasonal shift in labor created a unique social dynamic. Master craftsmen, who maintained workshops year-round, found their ranks swelled by skilled agricultural workers seeking to perfect secondary crafts during the flood months. The pottery workshops of Memphis hummed with activity as farmers turned potters worked alongside full-time artisans, their hands still bearing the calluses of agricultural work, now shaping clay with surprising delicacy. The rhythm of the potter's wheel echoed the eternal rhythm of the seasons, each vessel emerging from the earth as surely as the crops that would follow the flood's retreat. The most remarkable aspect of this seasonal labor system was how it enabled Egypt's monumental construction projects. When the fields lay underwater and farmers could not tend their crops, they became available for the massive undertakings that have defined Egyptian civilization in the modern imagination. Yet these projects were not the harsh, forced labor often depicted in popular culture, but rather an extension of the same cooperative spirit that governed agricultural life. The organization of flood season construction work reflected the sophisticated understanding of human nature that characterized Egyptian administration. Workers were organized into crews that maintained the social bonds of their home villages, ensuring that the transition from agricultural to construction labor felt natural rather than disruptive. The same foremen who organized harvest work in the fields became crew leaders at construction sites, bringing familiar patterns of cooperation and mutual support to the building of pyramids and temples. Archaeological evidence reveals the careful attention paid to worker welfare during these seasonal construction projects. At Giza, excavations have uncovered extensive facilities for housing and feeding construction workers, including bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves daily, and breweries that provided the beer that was a staple of the Egyptian diet. The workers' villages show evidence of medical care, with skilled physicians available to treat injuries and maintain the health of the workforce. The rhythm of construction work itself reflected the agricultural calendar. Just as farming required careful timing and coordination, so did the movement of massive stone blocks and the precise placement of architectural elements. The flood season provided the perfect opportunity for the most labor-intensive aspects of construction, while the growing season allowed for the more specialized work of artisans and the careful planning that such projects required. This integration of seasonal labor created a unique form of social mobility within Egyptian society. Skilled workers who distinguished themselves during flood season construction projects might find themselves recruited for year-round positions in royal or temple workshops. The careful records kept by Egyptian administrators document numerous cases of individuals who began as seasonal agricultural workers and eventually became master craftsmen or even minor officials within the construction bureaucracy. The flood season also provided opportunities for the development of specialized skills that served the broader economy. During the months when fields lay underwater, experienced farmers shared their knowledge with younger workers, creating informal schools where agricultural techniques, craft skills, and cultural knowledge passed from generation to generation. These seasonal gatherings became centers of innovation, where new techniques were developed and refined through the patient experimentation that the flood season allowed. The social dynamics of flood season labor created bonds that extended far beyond the immediate work at hand. Workers from different regions of Egypt found themselves laboring side by side, sharing techniques and stories that enriched the broader cultural fabric of Egyptian civilization. The construction sites became melting pots where regional variations in craft techniques were shared and refined, contributing to the remarkable consistency of Egyptian artistic and architectural traditions across vast distances and long periods of time. As evening approached each day during the flood season, the construction sites would quiet, and workers would gather around cooking fires to share the day's experiences. These moments of peaceful reflection, with the sound of the nearby Nile providing a constant, soothing backdrop, became integral to the social fabric of Egyptian life. Stories were shared, skills were taught, and the bonds of community were strengthened through the shared experience of contributing to projects that would endure for millennia. The wisdom embedded in this seasonal labor system extended beyond mere practical efficiency. It represented a profound understanding of human nature and social organization, recognizing that meaningful work, undertaken in cooperation with others and aligned with natural rhythms, could create not just impressive monuments, but also strong communities and satisfied individuals. The flood season became a time of both productivity and social renewal, when the bonds of Egyptian society were strengthened through shared purpose and mutual support. The gentle lapping of water against stone steps echoed through the administrative chambers of ancient Memphis, where scribes bent over papyrus scrolls in the soft light of oil lamps, their reed pens moving with practiced precision across surfaces that would preserve the wisdom of water management for millennia. These quiet offices, with their carefully organized shelves of records and their walls adorned with detailed maps of canal systems, represented the beating heart of perhaps humanity's most sophisticated early bureaucracy, a system born not from conquest or ideology, but from the simple necessity of managing the life-giving waters of the Nile. The development of Egypt's water management bureaucracy unfolded gradually, like the slow rise of the flood itself, beginning with local officials who understood their particular stretch of river and evolving into a kingdom-wide network of specialists whose expertise encompassed everything from hydraulic engineering to legal precedent. In the early dynastic period, village elders had simply observed the water levels and made decisions based on generations of accumulated wisdom. But as Egypt unified under the pharaohs, the need for coordination across vast distances created new forms of administrative organization that would influence governmental structures for thousands of years. The keeper of the royal canals, a position that emerged during the Old Kingdom, embodied this evolution from local knowledge to systematic administration. These officials, working from regional centers throughout the Nile Valley, maintained detailed records not only of water levels and flood timing, but of the complex relationships between irrigation schedules, crop rotations, and labor allocation that made Egyptian agriculture possible. Their offices, discovered by archaeologists in sites from Elephantine to the Delta, reveal a remarkable attention to detail. Papyrus documents listing the capacity of individual canal segments, the optimal timing for opening and closing sluice gates, and the careful calculations that determined how much water each district would receive during different phases of the agricultural cycle. The legal framework that grew around water management reflected the profound understanding that water was both a divine gift and a practical resource requiring careful stewardship. Egyptian law developed sophisticated concepts of water rights that balanced individual needs with collective welfare, creating precedents that influenced legal thinking throughout the ancient world. The Code of Water Distribution, fragments of which survive in temple archives, established principles for resolving disputes between upstream and downstream users, guidelines for maintaining canal systems, and procedures for emergency water allocation during years of unusually high or low floods. Local water courts, presided over by officials trained in both hydraulic engineering and legal precedent, met regularly in district centers throughout Egypt. These gatherings, held in the shade of sycamore trees near canal junctions, brought together farmers, engineers, and administrators to address the countless small decisions that kept the irrigation system functioning. The proceedings, recorded on ostraca and papyrus fragments, reveal a remarkable sophistication in balancing competing claims and finding solutions that served the broader community while respecting individual rights. The technical innovations that emerged from this bureaucratic framework demonstrated how administrative necessity could drive technological advancement. Egyptian engineers developed standardized measurements for water flow, creating the cubit-based system that allowed precise calculation of canal capacity and irrigation timing. They invented sophisticated sluice gate mechanisms that could be operated by a single person, but controlled the flow of water to hundreds of fields. Most remarkably, they created a network of signal stations that could communicate flood information across the length of Egypt within days, using a combination of fire signals, messenger relays, and standardized reporting procedures that ensured accurate information reached decision-makers when they needed it most. The quiet efficiency of these systems becomes apparent in the archaeological record, where well-maintained canal networks show evidence of continuous use across centuries. The careful engineering of these waterways, with their precisely calculated gradients and strategically placed distribution points, reveals a level of technical sophistication that required both theoretical understanding and practical experience. The fact that many of these ancient irrigation channels continued to function into the modern era testifies to the quality of both the original engineering and the administrative systems that maintained them. Perhaps most remarkably, this bureaucracy managed to balance central coordination with local autonomy, creating a system that could respond to kingdom-wide needs while remaining sensitive to regional variations. The flood arrived at different times in different parts of Egypt, and local conditions varied significantly between the narrow valley of Upper Egypt and the broad delta region. Rather than imposing uniform solutions, the Egyptian administrative system developed flexible frameworks that allowed local officials to adapt general principles to specific circumstances while maintaining coordination with the broader network. The human dimension of this bureaucracy emerges in personal letters and administrative documents that reveal the daily concerns of water management officials. These men, and occasionally women, carried enormous responsibility for their community's welfare, making decisions that could mean the difference between abundance and famine. Their correspondence reveals a deep sense of duty combined with practical wisdom as they balance the demands of superior officials with the needs of local farmers, always aware that their decisions would affect not just the current season, but the long-term sustainability of the agricultural system that supported Egyptian civilization. The sacred and the practical intertwined along the Nile like the gentle currents that carried both silt and prayers downstream, creating a unique spiritual economy where divine abundance and earthly planning merged into a single, harmonious system. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the flood waters reached their peak and the air carried the rich scent of fertile earth, temple priests would descend the stone steps of their sacred compounds, their movements as measured and deliberate as the rising waters themselves. These were not merely religious observances, but the careful administration of Egypt's most sophisticated economic institutions, where the management of divine gifts required both spiritual wisdom and practical expertise. The temples of ancient Egypt functioned as vast economic enterprises, their operations synchronized with the eternal rhythm of the flood cycles. During the season of inundation, when the Nile transformed the landscape into a temporary sea dotted with villages and temple complexes, these sacred institutions became centers of intense economic activity. The priests who tended the altars were also administrators, who managed extensive agricultural lands, oversaw complex irrigation systems, and coordinated the storage and distribution of grain that would sustain communities through the year. Their daily routines reflected this dual nature, beginning with dawn prayers that acknowledged the divine source of abundance, followed by careful inspections of temple granaries and detailed consultations with farmers about planting schedules and water management. The economic power of these temple complexes was staggering in its scope and sophistication. The Great Temple of Amun at Karnak, for instance, controlled vast estates throughout Upper Egypt, employing thousands of workers in agricultural production, craft manufacturing, and trade operations. During flood season, when farmers throughout the region found their fields underwater, many would seek temporary employment in temple workshops, creating textiles, pottery, and metalwork that would be traded throughout the Mediterranean world. The priests who supervised these operations understood that their spiritual responsibilities and economic duties were inseparable aspects of maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order that ensured the continued blessing of the floods. The religious festivals that marked the agricultural year served as sophisticated mechanisms for coordinating economic activity across the kingdom. The Opet festival, celebrating the annual flood, was simultaneously a spiritual celebration of divine abundance and a practical gathering where merchants, farmers, and administrators could coordinate their activities for the coming year. During these festivals, temple officials would announce the expected height of the flood based on their careful observations and calculations, allowing farmers throughout the region to plan their planting and harvesting schedules. The processions that carried sacred barges through flooded fields were also opportunities for priests to inspect irrigation systems and assess the condition of agricultural lands. The integration of spiritual belief with economic practice created a unique form of institutional thinking that viewed abundance as a divine trust requiring careful stewardship. Temple records from various periods reveal the sophisticated accounting systems that tracked not only the income and expenses of religious institutions, but also their broader economic impact on surrounding communities. Priests maintained detailed records of flood levels, crop yields, and storage inventories, creating databases that allowed them to predict economic trends and plan for periods of scarcity. This information was considered sacred knowledge, protected by religious sanctions, but also shared with royal administrators who relied on temple expertise for kingdom-wide economic planning. The concept of divine abundance shaped Egyptian economic thinking in profound ways, creating a culture that valued both generous giving and careful conservation. During years of exceptional floods, temples would organize massive public works projects, employing surplus labor in the construction of new buildings, the expansion of irrigation systems, and the creation of additional storage facilities. These projects were understood as offerings to the gods, expressions of gratitude for divine generosity, but they also served practical economic functions, providing employment during periods when agricultural work was impossible and creating infrastructure that would support future prosperity. The priest administrators who managed these complex systems developed sophisticated understanding of economic cycles and resource management. They recognized that the floods brought not only water and fertile silt, but also disruption to normal economic patterns, requiring careful coordination to ensure that communities could take full advantage of the opportunities while preparing for the challenges that followed. Their approach combined spiritual practices with practical techniques, using religious ceremonies to mark important economic transitions, while employing rigorous accounting methods to track resources and plan for future needs. The archaeological evidence reveals the remarkable sophistication of these temple economies, with storage facilities, workshops, and administrative buildings that rival any modern economic institution in their complexity and efficiency. The quiet courtyards of temple complexes, where priests conducted their daily business, were centers of economic innovation, where new techniques for food preservation, craft production, and trade organization were developed and refined. The integration of spiritual and economic functions created institutions that were both deeply rooted in Egyptian religious tradition and remarkably adaptable to changing economic conditions, ensuring their continued relevance throughout the long history of pharaonic civilization. The great river that had unified Egypt under a single crown also revealed, in its patient seasonal rhythms, the profound diversity that flourished along its banks. From the granite cataracts of Aswan to the spreading marshlands of the delta, each region developed its own intimate relationship with the flood, creating a tapestry of local adaptations that would, over millennia, demonstrate the remarkable flexibility of human economic organization when working in harmony with natural variation. In the southern reaches of Upper Egypt, where the Nile carved its path through sandstone cliffs and granite outcroppings, the flood arrived with a different character entirely from the gentle inundation experienced in the northern delta. Here, the river's voice carried the urgency of distant mountain storms, and the water rose with a swiftness that required immediate coordinated response. The people of Elephantine Island, positioned at the traditional southern border of Egypt proper, became masters of flood prediction, not through elaborate measurement systems, but through an intimate knowledge of subtle changes in watercolor, the behavior of riverbirds, and the almost imperceptible shifts in the river's sound that preceded the main flood by days or even weeks. These southern communities developed what might be called an economics of immediacy, where the compressed time frame of flood response created highly specialized roles and lightning-fast decision-making processes. When the flood approached, grain had to be moved to higher ground within hours, livestock driven to prepared shelters, and irrigation channels cleared of debris with remarkable efficiency. The archaeological record reveals storage facilities carved directly into cliff faces, accessible only during specific flood levels, suggesting an adaptation so precise that it could take advantage of the river's rise and fall with mathematical precision. The contrast with Lower Egypt could hardly have been more pronounced. In the delta, where the Nile split into multiple channels and spread across vast alluvial plains, the flood arrived as a gentle, almost imperceptible rising that could take weeks to reach its full extent. Here, communities had the luxury of gradual preparation, but faced the challenge of managing water across a landscape where the river's multiple channels created complex patterns of inundation that varied dramatically from year to year. Delta farmers developed sophisticated systems of communication between communities, using signal fires and messenger networks to coordinate the opening and closing of channels that could direct floodwaters to where they were most needed. The people of the Delta became Egypt's master hydraulic engineers, not through grand construction projects, but through countless small innovations that accumulated over generations. They developed techniques for reading the subtle signs that indicated which channels would carry the strongest flow in any given year, created temporary dams from woven reed mats and mud that could be quickly constructed or dismantled as conditions changed, and perfected methods for encouraging the river to deposit its fertile silt in precisely the locations where it would do the most good for the coming growing season. Between these extremes, the communities of Middle Egypt developed their own distinctive approaches to flood management. In the region around Memphis, where the river transitioned from the narrow valley of the south to the broader floodplain of the north, local administrators became specialists in what might be called flood diplomacy. They negotiated with upstream communities about water usage, coordinated with downstream settlements about timing, and developed legal frameworks for resolving disputes that arose when flood management decisions in one area affected agricultural prospects in another. The records from these Middle Egyptian communities reveal a sophisticated understanding of the river as a connected system, where actions taken at any point along its length would have consequences both upstream and downstream. This systemic thinking led to the development of what were perhaps the world's first interregional economic coordination mechanisms, where communities would agree to specific flood management practices that optimized agricultural output for the entire region, even when this meant accepting less than optimal conditions for their own immediate area. The economic implications of these regional variations extended far beyond agricultural production. Upper Egyptian communities, with their rapid flood response systems and cliffside storage facilities, became specialists in preserving and trading goods that required protection from moisture and rapid temperature changes. Their pottery, developed to withstand the dramatic environmental shifts of the southern flood cycle, became prized throughout Egypt and beyond. Delta communities, with their gradual flood cycles and extensive wetland management, became the kingdom's experts in fishing, fowling, and the cultivation of water-loving crops, like papyrus, that formed the basis of Egypt's writing and record-keeping systems. These regional specializations created trade networks that followed the rhythm of the flood itself. During the inundation season, when transportation by river became easier but land-based agriculture was impossible, communities would exchange their specialized products in markets that appeared and disappeared with the water levels. Archaeological evidence suggests that these seasonal markets were not chaotic affairs, but highly organized events where communities would gather to trade not just goods, but knowledge about flood management, agricultural techniques, and innovations in water control. The quiet sophistication of these regional adaptations becomes even more apparent when we consider how they influence the development of Egypt's administrative system. Rather than imposing a single, centralized approach to flood management, the pharaonic government developed a flexible system that allowed each region to maintain its traditional practices while coordinating overall flood response through a network of regional administrators who understood both local conditions and kingdom-wide needs. This balance between local autonomy and central coordination created a resilience that allowed Egyptian civilization to thrive for millennia, adapting to changing flood patterns while maintaining the essential economic relationships that bound the kingdom together. The wisdom embedded in these regional variations continues to offer insights for understanding how human communities can develop sustainable economic relationships with variable natural systems, demonstrating that true prosperity often comes not from fighting natural variation, but from developing the flexibility to work creatively within it. The gradual transformation of Egypt's flood-based economy unfolds like the slow retreat of waters after an unusually weak inundation, leaving behind not the familiar patterns of fertile mud, but something altogether different and uncertain. Archaeological evidence from the later periods of Egyptian history reveals a civilization grappling with the fundamental challenge that has faced human societies throughout time: how to adapt when the natural rhythms that have sustained life for millennia begin to shift and change. The papyrus records from the late period speak with quiet concern of floods that arrived at unexpected times or failed to reach the heights that generations of farmers had learned to expect. Temple archives from Edfu and Dender contain careful notations of water levels that no longer matched the ancient predictions of seasons that seemed to drift from their appointed times. The priests who had served as Egypt's economic forecasters for thousands of years found themselves recording measurements that challenged everything their predecessors had taught them about the river's behavior. In the administrative centers of Memphis and Thebes, scribes began developing new approaches to agricultural planning that moved beyond the traditional three-season calendar. Rather than relying solely on the predictable rhythm of Ket, Peretz, and Shemu, they created more flexible systems that could respond to floods that came early or late, high or low. These innovations required a fundamental shift in thinking, from the comfortable certainty of ancient patterns to the more complex challenge of managing genuine uncertainty. The farmers themselves, those who had always lived closest to the river's moods, began experimenting with techniques that their ancestors might not have recognized. In regions where floods became unreliable, communities developed more sophisticated irrigation systems that could capture and store water during periods of abundance. The quiet engineering of these local adaptations represents one of humanity's earliest systematic responses to environmental change, carried out not through dramatic pronouncements, but through the patient work of countless individuals adjusting their practices to new realities. Archaeological excavations at sites like Karanis in the Fayum reveal the material evidence of this transformation. The remains of water-lifting devices, more complex than anything found in earlier periods, suggest communities learning to work with less predictable water supplies. Storage facilities show signs of modification and expansion, indicating efforts to maintain food security even when traditional flood patterns could no longer be trusted. The pottery shards and tool fragments tell stories of technological innovation born from necessity, of people quietly adapting their daily practices to changing circumstances. The influence of foreign powers during this period added another layer of complexity to Egypt's agricultural transformation. Persian, Greek, and Roman administrators brought different approaches to land management and taxation, often misunderstanding the subtle relationships between flood cycles and economic planning that had sustained Egyptian civilization for so long. Yet rather than simply imposing their own systems, these foreign rulers often found themselves learning from Egyptian expertise, creating hybrid approaches that combined ancient wisdom with new techniques. The gradual abandonment of some traditional flood management sites speaks to the practical realities of this transformation. Nilometer stations that had functioned for centuries began to fall into disrepair, not from neglect, but because the information they provided no longer matched the economic realities communities faced. The careful stone steps that had once guided priests to precise measurements became monuments to a different relationship between human society and natural rhythms. Yet even as the old systems changed, the deeper patterns of Egyptian economic thinking proved remarkably resilient. The concept of planning for abundance and scarcity, developed through millennia of flood management, continued to influence how communities approached resource allocation and risk management. The administrative structures that had evolved to coordinate flood response found new purposes in managing the complexities of a more diverse agricultural economy. The transformation was not uniform across Egypt's vast territory. In some regions, particularly in the south, where flood patterns remained more predictable, traditional practices continued with only minor modifications. The delta, with its complex network of channels and varying flood impacts, became a laboratory for new approaches to water management. These regional differences created opportunities for specialization and trade that enriched the overall economy even as it became more complex. The quiet wisdom embedded in this long transformation offers profound insights for understanding how human societies adapt to environmental change. Rather than dramatic collapse or sudden innovation, the Egyptian experience demonstrates the power of gradual adaptation, of communities and institutions slowly adjusting their practices while maintaining essential functions. The river continued to flow, the seasons continued to cycle, and people continued to find ways to create abundance from the resources available to them. As we consider this ancient transformation from our modern perspective, we can appreciate how the Egyptians' deep understanding of natural cycles provided a foundation for resilience that served them well even when those cycles began to change. Their experience reminds us that true economic security comes not from rigid adherence to particular practices, but from the wisdom to adapt while maintaining the essential relationships between human communities and the natural world that sustains them. As we reach the gentle conclusion of our journey through the rhythms of ancient Egypt's flood-based economy, we find ourselves standing at the eternal banks of the Nile, where the wisdom of millennia flows as peacefully as the sacred waters themselves. The sophisticated systems we have explored, the careful mathematics of nilometer measurements, the patient accumulation of grain in vast storehouses, the seasonal dance of labor and rest, all speak to humanity's profound capacity to find harmony within the natural world's endless cycles. The ancient Egyptians understood something deeply peaceful about abundance, that true prosperity comes not from fighting against natural rhythms, but from learning to breathe with them, to plan with them, to find security within their gentle certainty. Their flood-based economy was, at its heart, an economy of acceptance, accepting the river's timing, accepting the season's gifts, accepting that wisdom lies in preparation rather than resistance. Picture now the timeless scene of dawn breaking over the Nile, as it has for countless thousands of years. The water moves with the same unhurried purpose it carried when ancient administrators carefully recorded its levels, when farmers watched for the first signs of inundation, when temple priests offered prayers of gratitude for the river's reliable generosity. In this continuity, we find something profoundly comforting: the knowledge that some rhythms transcend human ambition, that some systems endure because they work with, rather than against, the deeper patterns of existence. The flood cycles taught the Egyptians to think in longer terms, to see beyond immediate needs, to the patient accumulation of resources, the careful tending of systems that would serve generations. Their bureaucracy of water management, their seasonal coordination of labor, their integration of spiritual practice with economic planning, all emerged from this fundamental understanding that prosperity flows from alignment with natural abundance rather than from attempts to control it. As we let these images settle into peaceful contemplation, feel the gentle rhythm of the Nile's eternal flow. The water moves slowly, carrying the memory of ancient wisdom, the quiet satisfaction of systems that worked in harmony with natural cycles. The sound of water over stone, the soft lapping against riverbanks, the whisper of wind through papyrus reeds. These sounds have accompanied human economic activity for millennia, creating a backdrop of continuity that transcends any individual civilization's rise or transformation. In the growing twilight of our exploration, we can sense the profound peace that comes from understanding how human ingenuity can work with natural rhythms rather than against them. The Egyptian experience offers us a meditation on patience, on the wisdom of accepting what cannot be changed while carefully managing what can be influenced. Their flood-based economy was ultimately an economy of trust. Trust in the river's reliability, trust in careful planning, trust in the human capacity to create abundance through cooperation with natural systems. Let your breathing slow now to match the gentle pace of the Nile's flow, steady and unhurried, carrying away the day's concerns as surely as the river carried fertile silt to waiting fields. Feel the deep satisfaction of systems that endure because they honor both human needs and natural wisdom. In this peaceful understanding, we find rest, the rest that comes from knowing that some truths are as reliable as the river's annual flood, as comforting as the rhythm of seasons, as eternal as the flow of water toward the sea. The Nile continues its ancient journey, carrying with it the peaceful wisdom of civilizations that learned to prosper within nature's gentle embrace. And in that eternal flow, we too find our rest.